A solitary horse-drawn wagon creaked under the weight of hardtack, beans, and powder as it moved slowly through the Pennsylvania countryside. The lone teamster, eyes fixed ahead, represented just one of thousands, orchestrating perhaps the greatest logistical challenge of the American Civil War. While generals plotted grand strategies, quartermaster officers and commissary sergeants were waging their own battle, one that would ultimately determine the fate of the coming conflict as much as any tactical decision. For in the summer of 1863, as two mighty armies converged toward a small market town called Gettysburg, victory would belong not just to the side with superior tactics, but to the one that could feed, arm, and supply its men through the brutal days ahead. Armies march on their stomachs, Napoleon Bonaparte had famously observed decades earlier. And nowhere was this truism more evident than in the movements of the Union and Confederate forces in late June 1863. The Army of Northern East Virginia, nearly 75,000 strong, had been cut off from its Richmond supply base as it pushed northward into Union territory. Meanwhile, the Army of the Potomac, numbering around 95,000, struggled to maintain tenuous supply lines stretching back to Washington and Baltimore. This context draws upon assessments published in The Quartermaster Review, Winter, edition, 1876. For Major General George Gordon Meade, who had assumed command of Union forces just 3 days before the battle, the logistical nightmare seemed insurmountable. His predecessor, Major General Joseph Hooker, had begun moving the army north from the vicinity of Fredericksburg, but the supply arrangements remained dangerously incomplete. Meade needed to maintain pursuit of Lee's forces, while simultaneously ensuring that ammunition, rations, and medical supplies kept flowing to his own troops. The movement of such amounts of materiel required arithmetic beyond imagining, wrote Colonel Hardin Wilson in his memoirs. Each soldier required 3 pounds of food daily, which meant nearly 300,000 pounds for the Army of the Potomac alone every single day. Add to this 60,000 animals needing 25 pounds of feed each, and you have over 2 million pounds of forage required daily. The Union Army's standard daily ration consisted of 12 ounces of pork or bacon or 20 ounces of fresh or salt beef, 16 ounces of flour or bread or 12 ounces of hardtack, plus salt, sugar, coffee, and vinegar where available. Each soldier carried 3 to 5 days' rations in his haversack, often consisting primarily of the dense crackers known as hardtack, which one soldier described as indestructible enough to outlast the Egyptian pyramids. Behind the lines, Brigadier General Rufus Ingalls, Chief Quartermaster of the Army of the Potomac, directed a complex network of supply depots, trains, and wagon columns. The Army's primary supply base was established at Westminster, Maryland, connected to Baltimore by the Western Maryland Railroad. From there, a massive wagon train, spanning miles when stretched out on the road, would need to maintain contact with the advancing Union forces. Confederate General Robert E. Lee faced even greater supply challenges. Having crossed the Potomac on June 25th, his forces were operating in hostile territory. With limited wagon capacity, Lee's quartermaster officers were instructed to live off the land, requisitioning or simply seizing food and supplies from Pennsylvania farms and towns. Major Cook Stanfield, assistant quartermaster in Major General James Longstreet's 1st Corps, wrote, "The difficulty in procuring bread complicated all other matters. Flour could be obtained from local mills, but baking it into bread for thousands of men required ovens we did not have. The men were reduced to mixing flour with water and baking it on ramrods held over campfires, a thoroughly inefficient method that left many hungry." As June drew to a close, both armies were spread across southern Pennsylvania and northern Maryland, marching toward an appointment with destiny that neither had planned. Their movements were dictated not just by strategic calculation, but by the mundane yet vital concerns of supply. Roads were chosen not only for their tactical advantages, but for their proximity to sources of food, water, and forage. The greatest battle ever fought on American soil was being shaped by quartermaster officers as much as by generals. The railroads, those revolutionary arteries of iron, proved the decisive advantage for the Union Army as the two forces moved toward collision. While the Confederacy struggled with deteriorating rail infrastructure throughout the war, the Union's more extensive and better maintained network allowed for the movement of unprecedented quantities of supplies. In the days before Gettysburg, this disparity became increasingly apparent and crucial. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, along with the Northern Central and the Western Maryland lines, became the lifelines of the Army of the Potomac. From Washington and Baltimore, specially designated military trains ran day and night, carrying everything from artillery shells to horseshoes, bandages, to beef on the hoof. At Westminster, Maryland, the United States Military Railroad Construction Corps had established a massive supply depot where goods transferred from rail to wagon. No previous war in history had employed railroads to such extent, noted the Congressional Committee on the Conduct of the War in their 1866 report. The movement of hundreds of tons daily over distances that would have been impossible by wagon represented a revolution in military affairs as significant as any weapon. This information has been compiled from records found in the Annals of the War, published by the Southern Historical Society in 1879. Colonel Thomas Scott, former vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and now serving as Assistant Secretary of War for Transportation, coordinated the Herculean effort. Under his direction, damage to tracks caused by Confederate raiders was repaired within hours, and schedules were maintained with remarkable precision, despite the chaos of war. At the height of preparations, more than 60 trains per day arrived at supply depots near the Maryland-Pennsylvania border. For the Confederate forces, the absence of friendly rail connections meant reliance on wagon transport alone. Major General Isaac Trimble had advised Lee to seize the Northern Central Railroad early in the campaign, but other priorities had prevailed. Now, Confederate quartermasters struggled to manage with approximately 5,000 wagons. Impressive in number, but insufficient for the task at hand. Our wagons formed a line stretching nearly 20 miles when on the march, wrote Captain Lucas Barnwell of the Confederate Quartermaster Department. Yet still we found ourselves unable to carry sufficient ammunition and rations. The horses weakened daily, having been on half forage rations since crossing the Potomac. The disparity in supply capabilities was perhaps most evident in the artillery branches of the opposing armies. Each Union artillery battery maintained a caisson carrying 100 rounds per gun, with additional ammunition trains carrying hundreds more. The Confederate batteries, by contrast, entered Pennsylvania with an average of just 65 rounds per gun and diminishing prospects for resupply. Water supply presented another critical challenge. Each soldier required at least 2 quarts daily for drinking alone, more in the summer heat, and horses needed 8 to 12 gallons. Streams and wells along the route of march became critical strategic assets, their locations determining campsite selections and even influencing tactical decisions. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, commanding the Union Second Corps, wrote in his report, "We found ourselves compelled on 3 occasions to alter our line of march to secure adequate water supplies. The region had experienced unusual dryness. That summer, and many smaller streams marked on our maps proved disappointingly low or entirely dry. Medical supplies moved along these same tenuous supply lines. The Union Medical Department, under Jonathan Letterman's efficient direction, had established forward supply depots with bandages, chloroform, surgical instruments, and ambulance wagons. The Confederate medical services, chronically undersupplied since the war's beginning, faced the coming battle with particular dread. Dr. Hunter McGuire, medical director of the Confederate Second Corps, would later write, "We entered Pennsylvania, knowing that our medicine chests were nearly empty, with little hope of replenishment. As June 30th dawned, the day before battle would unexpectedly erupt. Both armies continued their complex dance of movement and supply. The Union's 5th Corps, led by Major General George Sykes, marched with relatively full haversacks and cartridge boxes. Meanwhile, in the Confederate ranks of Major General A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps, soldiers marched with many cartridge boxes only half filled and rations already reduced to minimum levels. The quartermaster officers on both sides worked through the night by lantern light, studying maps, calculating requirements, and dispatching riders with updated orders for the wagon trains following behind the fighting forces. The battle for Gettysburg had already begun, not with gunfire, but with ledger books, requisition forms, and the constant arithmetic of supply. While organized supply columns formed the backbone of both armies' logistics, a shadow war of foraging unfolded across the Pennsylvania countryside in the days before Gettysburg. For Confederate forces, living off the land was not merely expedient, but necessary. For Union commanders, preventing such Confederate requisitioning became another strategic imperative. Lieutenant General James Longstreet had organized systematic foraging operations that extended miles from the main Confederate line of march. Detachments under quartermaster officers spread out across Cumberland and Adams counties, with requisition forms printed specifically for the campaign. These forms promised payment in Confederate currency or certificates, offers that local Pennsylvania farmers received with understandable skepticism. I observed over 30 wagons being loaded with wheat, corn, and livestock at a single large farm near Chambersburg, wrote British observer Colonel Arthur Fremantle, who was traveling with Lee's army. The process was orderly, but clearly unwelcome to the farmer, who stood watching with evident distress as his harvest and livestock disappeared before his eyes. This account draws upon testimony collected by the Pennsylvania Civil War Claims Commission, 1868. Robert E. Lee had issued clear orders against unauthorized seizure of civilian property, hoping to maintain discipline and win Northern sympathy. No greater disgrace could befall the Army, and through it our whole people, than the perpetration of barbarous outrages upon the innocent and defenseless, he wrote in General Orders No. 72, issued as the Army crossed into Pennsylvania. Yet the needs of his hungry army inevitably led to confrontations with local civilians. Major James Harmon, Chief Quartermaster of the 2nd Corps under Lieutenant General Richard Ewell, later testified, "We attempted to maintain proper procedures, offering receipts for all goods taken. But the volume of supplies required, 15,000 pounds of bread daily for Ewell's Corps alone, made strict adherence to formalities impossible at times. When flour could not be had, we took wheat and sought out mills to grind it." The Confederate foraging operations yielded substantial results. Thousands of cattle and hogs, wagon loads of flour and grain, and hundreds of horses impressed into service. Yet these activities scattered valuable cavalry units that might otherwise have provided better intelligence about Union movements, a factor that would prove consequential in the coming battle. Union forces, operating in friendly territory, faced a different set of challenges. Army regulations strictly prohibited unauthorized foraging, with penalties including court-martial. Yet as supply wagons struggled to keep pace with the advancing troops, many Union soldiers also resorted to informal procurement from local farms. The distinction between friend and foe became conveniently blurred whenever hunger pressed, wrote Sergeant William Fairchild of the 149th Pennsylvania. While Confederate foraging parties might arrive with wagons and requisition forms, our men simply appeared at farm kitchens as hungry individuals, offering payment but making clear that refusal wasn't practical. The Union's Provost Marshal General, Marsina Patrick, dispatched mounted provost guards to patrol behind Union lines, attempting to prevent unauthorized foraging. These efforts met with limited success. One Pennsylvania farmer complained that he had been liberated from his chickens by the Confederates on Tuesday, then relieved of his remaining poultry by Union troops on Wednesday. For the residents of southern Pennsylvania, the competing demands created a nightmare. Some buried valuables and drove livestock into forests, while others resigned themselves to empty barns and smokehouses. The small town of Gettysburg had already endured Confederate requisitions when advance elements of the Army of Northern Virginia passed through on June 26th. Now, as Union forces approached from the south, the town's remaining resources faced new demands. Perhaps most critical to both armies was the procurement of horses and mules. With thousands of animals dying monthly from exhaustion, disease, and inadequate forage, both sides conducted extensive horse procurement operations. Confederate Major Harry Gilmore led a specialized unit that gathered over 500 horses from farms throughout the Cumberland Valley, while Union quartermaster officers negotiated purchases at somewhat inflated prices. As the final day of June 1863 arrived, the foraging war reached its peak. Confederate General Albert Jenkins' cavalry brigade swept through the vicinity of Gettysburg, gathering supplies and information, Meanwhile, Union cavalry under Brigadier General John Buford approached from the south, their horses badly in need of rest and forage after hard riding. Neither side yet recognized that the small crossroads town would become the site of the war's pivotal battle. But both understood that their ability to fight in the coming days would depend as much on successful foraging as on tactical brilliance. The Pennsylvania farmland, with its abundant wheat fields ripening in the summer sun, its orchards and pastures, had become as strategically important as any high ground or river crossing. While food sustained the soldiers, ammunition would decide their fate. In the final days before battle, the management of munitions presented uniquely difficult challenges for both armies. Each infantryman carried approximately 40 rounds in his cartridge box, with another 20 often stored in pockets or knapsacks. But the intense fire of 19th century combat could exhaust this supply in less than an hour of heavy fighting. Captain Theodore Dodge, ordnance officer of the Union, 2nd Corps, faced the daunting task of ensuring that his 30 ammunition wagons kept pace with the marching troops. "No supply function is more critical," he wrote in his official report. "A soldier without food may fight hungry. A soldier without ammunition becomes merely a target." The fundamental ammunition of both armies was the .58 caliber Minié ball, a conical lead projectile that had revolutionized warfare with its improved range and accuracy. Each Union Corps traveled with approximately 400,000 infantry rounds, roughly 60 tons of ammunition carried in specially designed wagons with reinforced axles. This information appears in the United States Ordnance Department reports published in 1874. Confederate ordnance officers operated at a significant disadvantage. While the Richmond Arsenal and other Southern manufacturing facilities had increased production impressively, the quality remained inconsistent. Moreover, the Confederate forces used a mix of imported British Enfield rifles, using .577 caliber ammunition, alongside American-made weapons, creating additional supply complications. Major William Allen, Chief Ordnance Officer for the 2nd Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, noted in his diary, "Our ammunition supply remains adequate, but concerning. The mixed calibers among our forces require maintaining at least 5 distinct types of cartridges. The wagons designated for ordnance supply have decreased from 75 at the campaign start to 58 through breakdown and enemy action." Both armies had established ordnance trains, dedicated wagon columns carrying nothing but ammunition, that followed approximately 1 day's march behind the main forces. For the Union Army, these trains connected back to the arsenal at Washington, which shipped fresh supplies daily by rail to Westminster. The Confederate ordnance trains, by contrast, carried virtually all the ammunition that would be available for the campaign, with no realistic prospect of resupply before returning to Virginia. Artillery ammunition posed even greater logistical difficulties. Each 12-pound Napoleon cannon, the most common artillery piece in both armies, required different ammunition types: solid shot for long-range fire, shell for explosive effect, case shot for anti-personnel use at medium range, and canister for close defense. Each type needed to be available in the right proportions. Union Artillery Chief Brigadier General Henry Hunt insisted on maintaining at least 200 rounds per gun, divided among the limber, caisson, and ammunition trains. This required nearly 1,000 wagons dedicated solely to artillery ammunition. "The weight and bulk of artillery ammunition limited our mobility severely," Hunt later wrote. Each decision to move the artillery reserve required calculating whether sufficient ammunition could accompany the movement. Confederate artillery suffered chronic shortages, particularly of high-quality fuses for shells. General Edward Porter Alexander, Longstreet's artillery chief, had personally supervised the testing of fuses before the campaign, but remained dissatisfied with their reliability. "A shell that fails to explode represents not merely a wasted shot," he wrote, "but a failure of industrial capacity that cannot be remedied on the battlefield." As the armies converged on Gettysburg, ammunition resupply became increasingly precarious. Union forces maintained relatively direct connections to their supply bases, though vulnerable to Confederate cavalry raids. The Confederate situation grew more difficult with each mile they advanced into enemy territory. By June 30th, Some Confederate infantry brigades reported ammunition levels below 30 rounds per man, a dangerously low figure if major combat were to occur. The challenge extended beyond mere cartridge counts. Percussion caps, the small copper caps containing fulminate of mercury that ignited the main powder charge, were chronically scarce in Confederate units. Without these small but essential items, rifles became little more than clubs. Confederate ordnance officers guarded their supplies of caps with particular vigilance, sometimes issuing them separately from cartridges to prevent wastage. Even weapon maintenance supplies, cleaning rods, oil, and repair parts traveled in these same ammunition wagons. After weeks of marching in summer dust or rain, many rifles required cleaning and maintenance to function reliably. Union regiments typically carried one replacement musket for every 20 men. Confederate units made do with fewer spares and more field repairs. As night fell on June 30th, neither army's commanders yet realized that the next day would begin the war's greatest battle. But their ordnance officers continued the ceaseless work of checking inventories, redistributing supplies, and calculating whether their stocks would prove sufficient for whatever lay ahead. In quarters and campsites across Adams County, Pennsylvania, thousands of soldiers performed their own ammunition checks, counting cartridges and percussion caps with the solemn attention of men whose lives might soon depend on these calculations. The final days of June 1863 unfolded. The most visible manifestation of military logistics was the seemingly endless procession of wagons that followed both armies. The Union Army's main supply train consisted of nearly 4,000 wagons and ambulances, stretched across 20 miles of road when moving in single file. The Confederate train, though smaller at around 2,500 wagons, represented an equally critical lifeline for Lee's forces. These massive wagon trains moved like great serpents across the Pennsylvania landscape, their progress often reducing to a crawl on narrow or muddy roads. Captain George Breck of the Union Artillery Reserve described the scene. From any hillside, one could observe the wagons stretching to the horizon, white canvas covers gleaming in the sun. Their movement created a continuous rumble that locals claimed could be heard from miles distant, like rolling thunder that never ceased. Each wagon represented a triumph of standardized military engineering. The Union primarily used the Model 1861 Army wagon, a 6-mule vehicle designed to carry up to 3,000 pounds of cargo. Confederate forces relied on a variety of wagon types, many of them impressed from civilian use, with less consistent capacity and durability. This account draws from the report of the Quartermaster General of the United States Army, fiscal year 1864. Major General Daniel Butterfield, serving as Meade's chief of staff, developed a meticulous system for organizing the Union wagon trains. Essential ammunition wagons traveled nearest the fighting forces, followed by ambulances and medical supplies, with food, forage, and baggage bringing up the rear. Each corps maintained its own train, identified by distinctive flags and markings that enabled troops to locate their supplies even amid the chaos of campaign. The management of wagon trains constituted a specialized expertise, wrote Colonel Richard Batchelder, Chief Quartermaster of the 2nd Corps. A single narrow bridge or steep grade could delay movement for hours. Each day's march required advanced planning of routes, with careful consideration of water sources and suitable terrain for overnight parks. Security for these valuable trains consumed significant military resources. The Union assigned entire regiments of infantry to guard duties, supplemented by cavalry patrols screening the flanks. Confederate wagon security often relied on convalescent soldiers, dismounted cavalrymen, and hastily organized local defense units, a disparity that would prove consequential when Union cavalry began threatening Confederate supply lines. The teamsters who drove these wagons represented one of the war's least celebrated but most essential occupations. The Union employed approximately one civilian teamster for every wagon, while Confederate forces often detailed soldiers to wagon duty, an assignment generally despised for its combination of hard labor and minimal glory. Simon Mackenzie, a teamster with the 6th Corps train, wrote in his journal, 12 hours at the reins constitutes an easy day. More often 16 or 18 hours of constant vigilance, fighting the mules forward through mud or dust, uphill and down, always with the knowledge that delaying the train might mean soldiers going without food or ammunition. It is thankless work. but as vital as any rifle-bearer's duty. Weather became a critical factor in the final days before Gettysburg. A series of summer thunderstorms swept through the region on June 28th and 29th, turning many secondary roads to mud and slowing wagon movement to less than 1 mile per hour in some sectors. Confederate quartermasters, less familiar with local geography, sometimes found their columns mired on impassable roads, forcing time-consuming detours. For the Army of the Potomac, the closest major supply depot remained at Westminster, Maryland, approximately 25 miles southeast of Gettysburg. As Meade's forces moved northward, maintaining connections to this vital hub became increasingly challenging. Brigadier General Rufus Ingalls, the Army's chief quartermaster, positioned relay stations at intervals, where fresh teams of horses and mules could replace exhausted animals. The Confederate supply situation grew more precarious with each passing day. Major General Jubal Early's division had pushed as far east as York, Pennsylvania, stretching supply lines dangerously thin. Confederate wagon trains now had to contend not only with the challenges of distance and terrain, but also with increasing Union cavalry activity in their rear areas. By June 30th, the fragility of Confederate logistics was becoming apparent to Lee's senior officers. Lieutenant General James Longstreet reportedly told his staff, "We must either find a way to replenish our supplies or consider adjusting our campaign plan. The Army cannot maintain its current positions indefinitely without secure supply lines." As night fell on the eve of battle, neither army had its wagon trains positioned ideally for the unexpected clash that would begin the following morning. Many Union supply wagons remained a full day's march from the advancing troops. Confederate trains were scattered across miles of Pennsylvania roads, vulnerable to Union cavalry raids. The massive logistical organizations that had sustained both armies through their northward movements would soon be tested by the enormous demands of sustained combat. Throughout that final night of June, wagon masters continued directing their teams by lantern light. Teamsters struggled with repairs to broken wheels and harnesses, and quartermaster officers revised their plans as new orders arrived. The Battle of Gettysburg would be decided not only by the courage of infantry and the placement of artillery, but by the mundane yet vital question of whether ammunition, rations, and medical supplies could reach the men who would need them in the coming days of carnage. Dawn broke on July 1st, 1863, revealing troops from both armies converging on the small town of Gettysburg. What neither side had fully anticipated was how severely the coming fight would test their logistical preparations. The battle that began almost accidentally would rapidly escalate into a struggle consuming supplies at rates that horrified even veteran quartermaster officers. As the initial clash unfolded west of town between Union cavalry under Brigadier General John Buford and Confederate infantry from Lieutenant General A.P. Hill's corps, the respective supply officers of both armies scrambled to adjust their arrangements. Captain Samuel Cooley, assistant quartermaster for the Union First Corps, received word of the engagement while supervising breakfast distribution near Emmitsburg. He immediately ordered ammunition wagons to move forward at accelerated pace. "The consumption of ammunition exceeds all previous experience," telegraphed Colonel Levi C. Turner to the War Department from the Union supply base at Westminster late on July 1st. "Request immediate forwarding of 200,000 additional infantry rounds and 40 caissons of artillery ammunition." By midday on July 1st, as Confederate forces gained the upper hand north and west of Gettysburg, the Union 1st and 11th Corps found themselves retreating through town towards Cemetery Hill. In the confusion, several Union ammunition wagons were captured, while others became separated from their assigned units. Lieutenant Colonel Gilbert Prey, Chief Ordnance Officer of the 11th Corps, worked frantically through the night to locate and redistribute available munitions. This information appears in the official records of the Union and Confederate armies, published by the United States War Department in 1889. For Confederate forces, the initial success brought its own logistical challenges. Major General Robert Rodes's division had expended nearly half its ammunition in the heavy fighting north of town. As night fell, ordnance officers moved forward under cover of darkness to distribute reserves from the ammunition train that had finally reached the Army's rear area near Cashtown. The wounded created another massive logistical demand. By sunset, on July 1st, More than 9,000 casualties from both armies lay scattered across the battlefield and throughout Gettysburg. Union Medical Director Dr. Jonathan Letterman implemented his revolutionary ambulance and field hospital system, establishing large treatment centers at farms behind Cemetery Ridge. The Confederate Medical Service, under Dr. Lafayette Guild, struggled with fewer ambulances and dwindling medical supplies. "We have converted every available wagon to ambulance service," wrote Confederate surgeon Dr. Simon Baruch, "but still hundreds lie where they fell. Our chloroform supply is nearly exhausted, and we perform surgeries with soldiers holding the patients down." As July 2nd dawned, the full scope of the battle was becoming clear to both armies. Union forces had established a strong defensive position resembling a fishhook, running from Culp's Hill through Cemetery Hill and south along Cemetery Ridge. Confederate units prepared for fresh assaults. The intensity of the previous day's fighting had already disrupted carefully laid supply plans on both sides. Union wagons converged on the Baltimore Pike behind Cemetery Ridge, establishing a massive supply park that one officer described as a city of canvas and wood. From this central location, ammunition and rations moved forward to the fighting units, while ambulances brought wounded men back to field hospitals. The Baltimore Pike itself became essential to Union logistics, as Meade's chief engineer, Brigadier General Gouverneur K. Warren, assigned pioneer units to ensure the road remained open regardless of weather or traffic. Confederate logistics suffered from more dispersed positions. With forces stretched around the Union fishhook from north to east to south, Lee's supply officers had to manage multiple distribution points. The absence of a single main road comparable to the Baltimore Pike forced Confederate wagons to use a network of smaller farm lanes, creating bottlenecks and delays. "Our ammunition resupply reached Johnson's division 3 hours after the designated time," noted Major Eugene Blackford. "The guides became lost in the unfamiliar terrain, and several wagons broke axles on the rutted farm tracks near Benner's Hill." The fighting on July 2nd brought ammunition consumption to unprecedented levels. Union Artillery Chief Henry Hunt imposed strict fire discipline to conserve shells, limiting counter-battery fire and reserving ammunition for critical moments. Confederate batteries, already operating with smaller reserves, found themselves rationing ammunition by mid-afternoon. Food preparation continued amidst the chaos of battle. Union field kitchens behind Cemetery Ridge produced coffee and hot meals for units rotated briefly out of the front lines. Confederate troops, more dependent on individual cooking arrangements, subsisted largely on uncooked rations, as many units remained continuously engaged. By the battle's third day, logistics had become perhaps the defining factor separating the two armies. The Army of the Potomac, operating on interior lines with a secure supply route, maintained relatively steady resupply despite enormous consumption. The Army of Northern Virginia found itself stretched to breaking point, with ammunition stocks for certain artillery projectiles completely exhausted and rations reduced to minimum levels. The culminating Confederate assault on July 3rd, Pickett's charge, represented not just a tactical gamble but a logistical endpoint. Confederate Artillery Chief Porter Alexander warned General Longstreet before the attack that ammunition supplies were insufficient for proper preparatory bombardment. "We cannot support a prolonged assault with our remaining stocks." As the battle concluded and Lee's army began its retreat toward Virginia, the full impact of logistics on the campaign's outcome became apparent. Union pursuit was hampered by its own supply challenges after 3 days of intense combat. But Confederate withdrawal was slowed even more severely by thousands of wounded men and the difficulty of moving supply trains through the mountain passes during heavy rainfall. Colonel Charles Wainwright, artillery commander in the Union First Corps, perhaps best summarized the battle's logistical dimensions in his diary entry of July 4th. "We speak often of courage and tactical brilliance, but this battle, like all others, was ultimately won through the unglamorous business of ensuring that the right supplies reach the right places at the right times. The greatest general ever born cannot fight without ammunition, nor can his men march far on empty stomachs." The Battle of Gettysburg thus stands as a testament not only to the courage of the fighting men, but to the enormous logistical apparatus that made their struggle possible. In the planning of campaigns and recording of battles, the dramatic movements of combat divisions rightfully command attention. But behind those movements always stood the critical, if less celebrated, achievements of the thousands who managed the vital flow of supplies that transformed strategic visions into battlefield reality.